Of course, my notes that I made for today's video have just disappeared, so we're just gonna have to wing it because 2020 has struck again. Let's do this! What's up creatures, it's Em and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be introducing you to my brand new pet. I'm sure you're all eager to meet the newest member of my little exotic family. However, I just wanted to put out a disclaimer that I have kept this species before. It's not an impulse buy. Please do your research anytime you bring home a new animal, and please consider that they are a living, breathing creature that you're providing for. They're going to cost you more than just an initial setup cost. There are ongoing costs, veterinary costs, and a lot of reptiles and amphibians live a very long time, so please don't be tempted to rush out and buy any kind of animal that I ever feature. Every single animal I keep is very well thought out and will be a long-term member of my family, not just a momentary fixture for a video. If you haven't already, remember to hit that subscribe button down below, become part of the creature crew, and also hit that notification bell down in the corner there so you don't miss a single upload. Without further ado, here is the newest member of my family, but they're still in their travel container because they only arrived last night. Ta-da! This is my brand new baby crested gecko. Oh, I am in love. Look at you being so cute and breathing and existing and just being adorable because you're existing. Are you gonna jump around? I thought so. You gonna chill out for me for a second? Hello. There we go. Oh, okay, that's great. We're just gonna hop around for a while. You gonna do it? You can usually tell when a crested gecko is going to jump because they prepare themselves by sort of flexing their back legs a little bit. They sort of pull down and then spring forward, so you can really feel them getting ready to jump in those back legs. It can be tricky to tell whether a crested gecko is a male or a female when they are this tiny. However, I do have my suspicions that this one may turn out to be a male just due to the size of the paws, which you can find under the base of the tail. I could be absolutely wrong. This is not by any means a closed case. I'm just going to assume that this crested gecko is male. Hence, I will now be calling him a he for now, but I could be eating my words down the line. We could end up with a female. This juvenile crested gecko is very fired down right now, and what I mean by fired down is that it is a very muted color. A lot of crested geckos will be a very fired down color when they are sleeping. When they fire up, it's often when they're awake and also when they're exposed to higher levels of humidity. So you'll often find crested geckos firing up after you've sprayed the enclosure. Right now, this crested gecko is extremely fired down. When this crested gecko is fired up, it goes a beautiful combination of dark chocolate brown as well as bright orange. You can actually see some of the firing up beginning to happen towards the base of this crested gecko's tail. Now, speaking of this tail, I want to be very gentle because although it is a semi-prehensile tail, which means that it helps this crested gecko to balance as well as to hold on to things, crested geckos are a species of gecko from New Caledonia which do have the ability to drop their tails if they are threatened or if they're captured. This is a defense mechanism to help them to escape predators. However, unlike other species of gecko like the leopard gecko or the gargoyle gecko, the crested gecko does not have the ability to regenerate its tail, which leaves them looking like this, also known as a frog butt. To be honest, I love it when crested geckos have little frog butts, but I don't want to startle this gecko and make it drop its tail, so I'm going to try and help it to keep its tail as long as it can. A lot of the time, many crested geckos you find have lost their tail due to breeding. They often drop their tails while breeding, and again, they don't grow back, and it can also be to do with just a loud noise. Many of my crested geckos in the past have dropped their tails in thunderstorms, so it's definitely something to look out for. It's nothing to be alarmed about if your crested gecko does drop its tail. It's just one of those things. It's natural, it happens, but I don't want to startle this gecko gecko and make it happen. All crested geckos are a little bit flighty and fidgety when you first bring them home. You have to remember you're very large, and a lot of pet store crested geckos won't have actually been held, so this is actually potentially a terrifying experience for this baby crested gecko. So I'm not going to hold him too much longer, but he is definitely settling down, and I want to end this very first handling session of ours on a positive note so he doesn't go back into his travel enclosure feeling as though he has been absolutely terrified by the experience. So that little hole that you can see right there, that is its ear. It can hear, it has very good hearing, so I'm trying not to be too loud. And you can really see why they're called crested geckos, because they have little crests that go down each side of their head. Some crested geckos have them more pronounced than others. This one has more crests on one side of its head than on the other, which is actually very cute. So there are 3 names that I am considering for my new baby crested gecko, and I would love it if you could help me out with choosing which one you think is the best. The first name on my list, the one that came to mind immediately, was Yeet, because they like to jump and just yeet off into the abyss. The next one that I had in mind was actually Abyss, because that's kind of a cool name. And then the third name that I was considering was Sploot, because after they've yeeted off into the abyss, they sploot onto a surface, and that means that they land belly down with all their legs out in a perfect sploot position. So it's either between Yeet, Abyss, or Sploot. What do you like the best? Leave me a comment in the comment section below. Alright, it is time to set up this enclosure. The enclosure that I'm going to be setting up today is a temporary enclosure. This crested gecko will grow, and once it is an adult size, it's going to need an enclosure roughly this size behind me. But for now, I want to be able to ensure that my crested gecko is eating and pooping correctly. So to do that, I'm going to be giving it a very basic minimalist setup, and I'll show you how I do that right now. So what you can see here in front of me is I have this absolutely tiny little enclosure. It really is so small. This is my hand, and I've got a small hand. And this enclosure is by EXOTerra. The reason why I'm going with such a small enclosure when all of my other animals have very large enclosures, I mean that's 2 cockroaches in that. But the reason I'm going so small is because I want to be able to monitor my baby crested gecko and make sure that it's eating correctly. You might want to know how you can monitor a crested gecko to understand if it's eating, and the best way to do that is to look out for poop. So we've actually got a tiny little bit of poop up here in the travel enclosure, so I can tell it has eaten fairly recently. But in this enclosure I'm going to set it up very, very basic, just so that I can make sure that my crested gecko is getting established. Oh, hello Jolene. There's a chicken watching me from upstairs. These enclosures come standard with a foam background, which is non-toxic, and in general a lot of geckos do like to hide in them. I personally really dislike them, and the reason why I dislike them is because, can you see at the very bottom here, there are 2 little hollowed out areas, and a lot of live food will escape around the back and foul up there, so it can become a bit of a hazard. That's also a very, very big space for a crested gecko to get stuck behind. So if you are not able to keep a very close eye on your baby crested geckos or other baby geckos, they can actually end up getting stuck around the back here, because you can see that there are again 2 little gorges, 2 little divots where live foods can sort of just sit there and die and get foul, and baby crested geckos, once they find their way back here, might not find their way back to the front. So I really don't like those backgrounds. They do have their uses. Plenty of geckos do enjoy hiding in these crevices, and it does give them a new texture to climb on. Now normally for a baby crested gecko I would remove this because I wouldn't want them getting stuck around the back, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug the very bottom with paper towel. The reason why I'm going to be keeping this in when I've said how much I really dislike it is because I'm going to be feeding this crested gecko crickets tonight, so I'm going to be plugging it to make sure that the crickets can't go underneath, but the crickets will be encouraged to climb. Now the crested gecko is an arboreal species of gecko. It likes to hello zombie zombie's like looking at me. Crested geckos like to climb. They feel very secure, nice and high up. So their food, given that it's going to climb, should be able to be accessible, and that way the crested gecko won't have to come to the floor where it's going to feel a little bit more exposed. For substrate, I'm going to be using really simply paper towel, and the reason I'm using paper towel is because it will be able to show me very easily if my crested gecko has gone to the bathroom. It's also non-ingestible, so it can't cause an impaction. There we go, I've just plugged the bottom. Nothing is getting underneath or through to the back of this enclosure. And now at the bottom here, I've just put our paper towel. It's slightly wet around the sides just to help it to stick down, and I've also made it so that the fold of the paper faces forward. And the reason I've done that is so that I can check to see if my baby crested gecko has found its way inside the paper towel. You can see here that I have some micro crickets. These will be gut loaded and dusted before feeding tonight. They won't all be going in at the same time. That might be a bit too overwhelming for my baby crested gecko, so I'll just be putting in about 5 that I can keep an eye on at a time. But aside from that, my crested gecko will be getting dusted micro crickets, which are gut loaded, twice a week, or maybe 3 times a week depending. But aside from that, it will be eating Pangea. So I do have these Pangea bowls, which are great. Pangea is a wonderful fruit mix, which is a complete diet for crested geckos. Not sponsored, by the way, I just really like their foods for my crested geckos. They've always thrived on them. They've also been absolutely fantastic for my gargoyle geckos. But the reason I'm not using these dishes right now is this is too deep, and I don't want my crested gecko to have to perch on the side and dip its head down to eat, because it just might feel a bit exposed. So instead, what I'm going to do for the meantime is just to use this really big flat feeding bowl. It's going to stay in here, but I will not be putting food all over this dish. What I'll be doing is just concentrating the food in one pocket so that the crested gecko has a nice space to sit down and eat. I've just added this fake plant into the enclosure. You guys, if you've been following me for a while, know that I rarely use fake plants. Every single plant that I have in any of my enclosures is real, and it takes a bit of extra effort, but I just think it's better for the animals, and I think it's more aesthetically pleasing as well. But the reason I'm using fake plants is because I don't have a plant that is small enough or sturdy enough yet for my baby crested gecko. Crested geckos do absolutely love certain types of plants. In particular, they love bromeliads, which is ironically what I found this crested gecko sleeping in when I chose it at the pet store. And actually, serendipitously over here, my old bromeliad has died, the mother plant has died, and it is growing some pups. This pup is not yet ready to come off of the mother plant. I mean, you can, but I'd like it to grow a little bit more, and then once it's a little bit more sturdy, I will plant it in here or into the next upgraded enclosure so that the crested gecko can sleep in a real bromeliad. These little hiding spots are great for crested geckos to just like sandwich themselves in between. So if you do have a crested gecko and you're thinking of creating a planted enclosure, bromeliads are a very safe and very aesthetically pleasing and useful choice. I have also added this piece of wood in here. It is nice and dry. It hasn't been exposed to any of my other geckos, so there won't be any kind of cross-contamination. I did pour a boiling hot kettle over it the other day, so it should be nice and sterile. And the reason why I've actually positioned it this way is it makes a nice little hiding spot for the food dish, so the crested gecko can theoretically hide in the bushes and then come down here not feeling too exposed, not seeing too much glare from my computer. Hello chickens, sky nuggets. It should feel nice and sheltered without feeling too exposed. Another word about these enclosures is you want to make sure that the top is securely fastened. This is the ventilation at the top here, but also make sure that if you are using any of these enclosures such as the Zoomed or Exoterra or even the Zilla designs, they have this sort of ventilation system here, right here, but then they also have these two areas for thermostats and temperature readers. So for that, we're not going to need those, we're just going to close those up. I doubt that the crested gecko could actually fit through there, but I wouldn't put it past him, and I also don't want any crickets to escape into the house. And now all that's left is to give this enclosure a nice little spray down to get the humidity up, and then it should be ready for my new crested gecko. The world can definitely be a very scary and overwhelming place for such a small gecko. So don't be alarmed if you do find them to be hiding a lot. They are a predominantly nocturnal or crepuscular species, meaning that they're most active at dawn, dusk, and at nighttime. During the daytime, most crested geckos will be asleep. So if you're going to be handling your crested gecko, it's probably best to do it in the evening when it's starting to wake up. And now I'm just going to let it settle in so it can find its own routine and get comfortable in the room with the smells and the tastes and the sounds. Depending on your climate and where you're going to be setting up your crested gecko, you want to make sure that they are out of direct sunlight. As bright as it looks in this room, there is never any direct sunlight in this room. I'm actually below the ground. And it's also very warm down here. Now, when it comes to reptiles, you often think that warmer is better. When it comes to crested geckos, they are very sensitive to overheating. So I am not going to be using a heat mat at this time for this crested gecko. It is more than warm enough down here, and the temperature drop in this room does not drop below 68. So at nighttime, it's going to be very adequate for this crested gecko, and during the daytime, it's slightly on the warmer side for the crested gecko, but not so much so that it's going to be uncomfortable. It stays between 72 and 75 down here at all times. It is probably the warmest room of the house, so any warmer than that would be too much for this gecko, and that's why I am not sticking a heat mat to the enclosure at this point. It's also why I've specifically chosen glass. Glass does not insulate very well, and I'm not looking for insulation for this gecko at this time. Of course, going forward as it grows, I will be reevaluating that and moving it to a different part of the room, into a different enclosure, but for now, in this location for this gecko, this is a great setup and it should thrive. But I am going to be keeping a close watch over the next few days, and if I feel it needs more heat or less, then I'll be sure to move it, because we wouldn't want the crested gecko to melt. He melted. You might be wondering how I feel about crested geckos and UV light, given that there's no UV being provided in this enclosure at this time. I personally believe that crested geckos, and all geckos for that matter, do thrive when they have exposure to UV, but also ample space to get away from it if they want to. And for that reason, I'm actually potentially going to be moving this enclosure into this one over here, which actually does have ample UV. So this is a really big enclosure. It's just 2 cockroaches in here right now. It's not finished, but once it's finished, I might leave some space at the back for this enclosure to go in and share the UV and the heat from in there. However, because there is heat in there, and these are Madagascan hissing cockroaches, they are kept at a slightly higher temperature than this New Caledonian gecko. So I'm not willing to do it right now. The heat is not too much. It's situated at the front here where my cockroaches like to bask, and then the cooler end is actually at the back there. So what I could do is put the crested gecko at the back there, but right now I'm very happy and comfortable with the crested gecko being over here, and as it grows I will be exposing it to a little bit more UV, but right now for the next couple of weeks until just after the new year, this is where my crested gecko is going to be acclimating to my room, and also a place where I can keep a very, very close watch on it. When it came to actually picking out my crested gecko, I knew that I wanted to go to one of my favorite stores in Denver, and that is all the way north of Denver. It's actually in North Glen. It is a store called Scales and Tails, and I actually know a couple of the people who work in there who are just so lovely, so I just wanted to give a really big shout out in particular to Dylan Dallas and to Shelby as well. Shelby was actually the previous owner of Vexus, my female tokay gecko, who she entrusted to me, so it's really nice to get to go into that store, which is pristine, by the way. And that's actually really important, is when you're going to buy a crested gecko, or any animal for that matter, take a look at the store you're buying from. If a store is really grimy up front, you don't want to know what's happening around the back where they're keeping most of the stock animals. So I would personally avoid unless you're really impressed with a store. I'm always very impressed when I go into the North Glen Scales and Tails, so I knew that I was going to be getting a nice healthy gecko, which also came with a health guarantee, so that's really fantastic. And I was given the opportunity to just sit there and really consider which crested gecko to look for. When picking out my crested gecko, I wanted to pick a nice healthy gecko with darker colors, because I really like that darker color aesthetic on a gecko. The buckskins and the Dalmatians are very pretty. The lily whites of course are stunning, but for me I like the darker crested geckos, and those with the browns and the oranges and the reds. So that's what I was really looking for, and this one just stuck out to me. It was to do with the head. I mean, first of all, it was hiding in the bromeliad, which I just thought was super cute, and it just had this look of like, you can't see me, don't pick me. So naturally I was like, I see you, I'm picking you. And just the colors, it had this beautiful contrasting darkness to its light, whereas some of the other ones, Dobby, stop. And ultimately the reason why I did decide to choose to bring this particular crested gecko home was because it was just beautiful overall body condition. It had such lovely contrasting colors between the darkness of its sides and its tail, as well as its head. It had beautiful almost triangular shape on its head, and it just had this expression that was somewhere between I love you and I hate you, which I gravitated towards. Oh, I'm gonna have to speak to my therapist about that one, aren't I, Dobby? Yes, I think so. Literally editing this video, and I threw some of those micro crickets into the enclosure, and the gecko decided to eat. That's great. Superb. Really happy about that. I'm literally putting the finishing touches on the video, which is going to be coming out tomorrow, as in Friday, the 18th of December, and he's just decided to eat. That's great. Oh, you're gonna go for... Yeah, boy! Nice! Look at you, little hunter! That's amazing. Good for you. I'm right here and editing, and the lights are still on. Someone was hungry. What a great result. Nice. And that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed meeting and getting to know my new crested gecko. Please help me to pick a name. Write a comment down below. Do you think that my new crested gecko should be called Yeet, Void, Yeet, Sploot, or Abyss? Thank you guys all so much for watching. I will see you in another video soon. Bye. Why am I so hyper today? I can't concentrate. Oh my goodness. I can't concentrate. Do you regret clicking on this video yet?